Hello, good evening. It's Father Alexander here. Welcome to St. Peter's in Hove and for another step of the journey through the Bible and into the depths of the book of Deuteronomy. And tonight I just want to look at the second discourse of Moses in the book of Deuteronomy, which is chapter 5 to chapter 11 inclusive. Now, it's quite often repetitive, goes over what the children of Israel have already experienced, and it warns them about the perils that may await them in the promised land. The perils are not physical perils, but rather they're spiritual temptations. Now, if we look at, for example, let me find it, chapter 8, verse 11. Moses says, "Be careful not to forget the Lord your God." Good advice. One of the things we're constantly asked to do by Jesus Christ is remember. Do this in remembrance of me. We are constantly exhorted by Jesus Christ to call to mind the things he has done for us. We're constantly exhorted by the God of the Old Testament and the Old Testament itself to remember the things that God did for our ancestors, our spiritual ancestors. So remembrance is good, forgetting is always bad. So be careful not to forget the Lord your God, and be careful. That is to say, take care you don't forget. Constantly make an effort to remember. Don't just sit back on your laurels and think it'll look after itself. No, be careful. Take care. Put in a bit of effort. Put in a bit of spade work. The way you can forget what God has done is, of course, by neglecting his commandments, customs, and laws, which I'm laying down for you today. So the laws, customs, and commandments serve to make us remember what God has done. Now, that is extremely profound. If you were Jewish, now I'm not, and I am assuming you're not, everything you do is designed to make you remember what God has done for you. So, for example, if you grow these peyote, these curls that come down here, you are remembering the law, which I think is in Leviticus, saying, do not cut the corners of your beard. And therefore, you're remembering that God spoke in Leviticus, giving you a law, and that you are carrying this on. We've also got the Shema, which comes in chapter 6, I think. And he says, "Hear, O Israel." It's 6, 4, and 5. "Hear, O Israel, the Lord your God is one Lord, the only Lord," and so on. And it says something wonderful. "You shall put these words on your doorposts of your house and on your gates." In other words, every time you go in or go out, you note the law of God is there. There's a little scroll of the Torah in that little container, and you go like that and you kiss it. Constant reminding. So the laws, the customs, and the commandments are constant reminding us. Now, we Catholics don't have this elaborate way of living, and it is a rather elaborate way of living, it has to be said, that constantly brings to mind that we are the people of God, and we constantly remember that we are the people of God, all things he's done for us. But things like getting out of bed and praying the first moment you get out of bed, praying the moment you go into bed, in other words, your first moment of consciousness in the day, your last moment of consciousness the day, saying the office 5 times a day, saying grace at every meal 3 times a day, going to Mass on Sundays at least, but also during the week. All these are reminders to us, efforts we make, care we take to remember what God has done for us. And then he says, when you've eaten all that you want, when you've built fine houses to live in other words, when you're comfortable, when you've seen your flocks and herds increase, your silver and gold abound, and all your possessions grow great, do not become proud of heart. Again, extremely profound. When you're prosperous, when you're happy, when the hard times of the desert are behind you and receded to the distance, do not become proud of heart. That's verse 14, chapter 8. Do not then forget Yahweh your God, who brought you out of Egypt, out of the place of slave labor. In other words, when you become a great man, please don't forget you were once a slave, and that the person who rescued you from slavery in the house of bondage was God. Don't think that these achievements are your own personal achievements. It goes on. Do not then forget what God did, and so on and so forth. Beware of thinking to yourself, verse 17, my own strength and the might of my own hand have given me the power to act like this. Remember the Lord your God. Again, it says it again and again. Remember the Lord your God. Remember the Lord your God. He was the one who gave you the strength to act effectively like this, thus keeping you then as today the covenant which he swore to your ancestors. Now that as today is interesting, because that as today is the Deuteronomist speaking. It's somebody speaking at the time of the King Josiah and saying, the fact that you are now a kingdom, that you're now living in Jerusalem, that you're now living in a relatively prosperous kingdom, in fact, a very prosperous kingdom, because the time of Josiah was a time at the middle of the Josiah's reign when Israel was prospering. Please remember, you're just a bunch of runaway slaves. It's God who made you great. You did not make yourselves great. So the Deuteronomist here is putting into Moses' mouth a exhortation against the sin of pride, but he's really addressing it to his own contemporaries, the people at the time of King Josiah. Although, of course, as we've seen, the people of Israel in the desert were certainly not immune to the sin of pride. So it's a warning when you get into the kingdom, when you take possession of the land, don't fall into the sin of pride. And you people living in Jerusalem, please don't fall into the sin of pride. And of course, the sin of pride is the number one sin that goes against faith. It's the opposite virtue to pride. We often think of it as humility. Well, that's correct. But the real opposite virtue to pride, spiritual pride, is faith. Faith is relying entirely on God. Faith is attributing to God the things that God has done rather than attributing those things to ourselves. So, for example, if you've got any achievements at all, and we've all got achievements, I mean, we've all done various things of which we can be fairly proud, I suppose. You know, I've got a doctorate from the Gregorian University. I mean, how good is that? I sat through all those lectures, and I then wrote a thesis, which has been published, and you can buy it. It costs £50. I don't think anybody ever has bought it, apart from libraries. You know, I've done all that, but who enabled me to do that? God. So we mustn't rest on our laurels. We must attribute our laurels to God. The person who has crowned us with laurels is the hand of God. We didn't do it ourselves. So that, I think, is a very important lesson to be learned from the book of Deuteronomy. And don't forget, the greatest sin of all, many people think, oh, well, it's something else. The greatest sin of all is the sin of pride, because the sin of pride encompasses all the other sins, really. So I think do have a look at the second discourse of Moses. It's frightfully good. It's a bit repetitive, but it is frightfully good. And I'll see you again. We'll go on to the third discourse of Moses. All the best for now. Bye.